Everyone. Time being 7 o'clock, we're going to call this meeting of the Finance Committee of February 29th, 2024 to order. Before we get started, I just want to mention to everyone that this meeting is being taped through WCTV. And under public comments, there'll be a 3-minute limit on any public comment per person. So I'd like to take a roll call. John Doherty is excused. Mary Ann Galezzo.
Here.
Chris DiOrio is excused. Brad Jackson.
Here.
Andy Levine.
Here.
Joe Levino.
Here.
Scott Neville.
Here.
David Tomei.
Here.
And Teresa Manganelli. Okay, well, it's our pleasure to welcome the Wilmington Public Schools tonight. And you're on.
Well, thanks, everyone. Good evening. Glenn Brand, Superintendent of Schools, and with me, this gentleman on my right, your left, Paul Ruggiero here, and we're pleased, along with other folks in our audience, to be able to share with you our budget plan for the 2024-2025 school year. I passed out, just before we begin, I passed out a folder for almost all of you, but one folder, but some contents there. Not budget related per se, but I just thought it was a great opportunity to share some information that we're awfully proud about. Some of you I know have connections to the high school, but not necessarily everyone directly if you no longer have children in the school system or at younger grades. But there's a lot of exciting things, I think, happening in the district, and we tried to highlight some of those as we continue to try and make that information known amongst our community. Some of the documents that you have in there, just really quickly. We have a newly created brochure for the high school. Lots of other high schools in the area often will have sort of a one-pager overview for families and students to provide sort of a quick glimpse of the programs and activities and offerings at a high school, at their high school. And in particular in this time period where my sense is this is not just unique for Wilmington, but many students and families have a lot of choices for high schools. And so we recognize that's important to try and convey to students and families as they're considering alternatives. We have a brochure in there that we created earlier this year along with Mr. Gendron. One of the PR pieces that we're working on too, but it's a flyer that we share with the community that highlighted the fact that Wilmington High School was ranked on the U.S. News Best School Rankings this year for the first time, is my understanding. 79th in the Boston metro area, ranked 104 out of 405 high schools in the state, in the top 40 across the country. So we're pretty proud of that. That ranking, in case you're not familiar with that, U.S. News, schools are ranked on their performance on state-required tests, graduation requirements, as well as how they prepare students for college, and there's some different metrics for that. And in addition to that, just some samples of the community newsletters that have come through my office in our district, again, trying to make sure that our community knows a lot of the good work and things that are taking place in our school system. So I'll walk through the slides. I know that you have a hard copy. My understanding is thanks, Paul, for the hard copy as well as electronic copy. I don't think we're going to go through it as I understand on the screen, but certainly, there's a great opportunity for conversation and discussion around the budget plan, but if I may, I'll try and swiftly move through the slides, the slide deck that you have before you. The second slide, first just want to take this opportunity to introduce members of our team, and I do deliberately use that term. Oftentimes we refer to this as the superintendent's budget, but certainly it's far more than any one's budget. It is a team effort to get here. Getting to this point, I want to take the opportunity to introduce these folks who are here tonight with me, our central office team. I know that you see through these presentations Paul and myself a lot, but with me in the audience tonight we have Christine Elliott, our assistant superintendent for curriculum and staff development, Alice Brown-Legrand, our director of student support services, Ken Lord, our Director of Information Technology and Digital Learning, Andrea Stern-Armstrong, our Director of Human Resources. This we refer to as our central office leadership team. And along with them, our support of our wonderfully supportive and active school committee members, David Ragsdale, our chair, Jesse Fenley, our vice chair, MJ Burns, our secretary, Jennifer Bryson, Mike Mercaldi, Jay Samaha, and Stephen Turner are all part of our school committee and have spent an awful lot of hours respectively as well, helping us work to this point in time. So I'll move on to the third slide in the slide deck if you're following along. There's a lot of information tonight that we want to try and go through and try to highlight the more key topics or the major topics that this presentation addresses, in which you have information in the packet to support. As I begin, though, I think there's a couple of key things that I just want to take the opportunity to point out. First off, this FY25 budget aligns with the temporary town manager's request from a fiscal level and reasonably allows us to meet our operational needs for the school year ahead. I think that's the first and important piece. The second, certainly to point out, and more commentary on this as we go through the presentation, that these are challenging times fiscally for, I think, all operations. I mean, we can relate to that as individual homeowners. I'm sure we would all agree. It's certainly the case. I would imagine the private sector, but I know it's the case in the public sector, especially for education, in a time that's challenging. This seems to be the case for school departments everywhere. I'm proud of the fact that our efforts, while maybe not easy to get to this point, have allowed us to be as conservative as we think we can be in these difficult times. I subscribe to a daily educational journal put out by the Massachusetts Association of School Committees. It's a quick glance at the educational topics throughout the state and the country, and it seems very clear that these budgetary struggles that are facing by districts far and wide, not just here in Massachusetts, but throughout the country. And third, this collectively is putting certainly a lot more pressure on organizations like ours to try and adjust to and respond to. The fourth slide, for those following along here. So I thought it would be important to take a look back to where we were at this point in time, about a year ago, going into fiscal year 24. Arguably, the challenges in some respects, I think, to characterize, were even greater than in some respects, differently than this year. First off, that you recall we talked about the tremendous state-approved out-of-district tuition increases that we were planning for of up to 14%. By all accounts, almost all of these agencies raised their rates up to that level, which we were anticipating, but that seemed to have occurred. And I will note, and I think it's important to point out, any significant increases in state funding for the reimbursements of these costs, otherwise known as circuit breaker, did not follow with those increases. And that's not a Wilmington challenge alone, it was throughout the Commonwealth. We were required to go out for a new bus contract, you might recall, and that amounted to almost a $100,000 increase as we planned the budget for this fiscal year. After being at a meeting yesterday with some superintendent colleagues who are in the same place that we were a year ago, they're going out to bid, and they're also blown away by the increases that they're seeing as part of their bids. And then finally, the fact that some of the key positions that we felt we had to add through COVID, through the grant money that was made available to districts as part of the recovery efforts, those were funded with grants. Those grants came to an end last year in most cases, and our decision was squarely in front of us as a school system, either to remove or cut those positions or to add them to our budget. And we followed the path of the latter, thinking and believing that it was in the best interest of our students and our families to add them. For the most part, we opted to continue our operations with those positions in place. We'll talk a little bit more about one of those family engagement specialists a little bit later. The fifth slide, in total, I think it's also worthy to, again, point out, the district reduced our total staffing complement by 7 FTEs. We refer to that as full-time equivalent staffing, particularly at our middle school and high school level. Those reductions were based largely on enrollment shifts, a path that we started long before my tenure here in the district, a path that goes back many years. As was highlighted last year during our various budget presentations, I firmly believe that the clear storyline about our district's staffing patterns over the last decade plus is rooted in a couple of things. First, our student needs. Just like those districts all around us, every district that Wilmington touches, the needs of students have shifted greatly over the years. We've tried to touch upon this and expand upon this in our recent presentations. More students require simply more interventions and various levels of specialized support, and usually that is in the form of staffing. Second, as a result, and because we are a public institution, education institution, very different than private institutions, we have a wide variety of legal obligations that are associated with special education and other related services to meet. And thirdly, our continued commitment as a school system to educate as many students who are part of Wilmington families in our classrooms here in our town. In fact, that number of out-of-district students who were placed in out-of-district schools about 8 or 9 years ago was around, and these are approximate numbers, around 90 students. That number now sits at approximately, again, round numbers, around 50 students. That decline is based on far more than just a parallel decline in enrollment throughout our school system, but also the intentionality around establishing more intensive special education programs in our district, in our schools, that do require usually more staff. Moving on to slide 6. This may resemble something that you think you've seen before, and you have. It's a slide that we've updated here, but we think it's an important one, and we think it's an important one because what it demonstrates, I think, very clearly, is the intersections, if you will, with staffing and the various categories of staffing that we track over time. These are the factors that directly impact staffing, and the fluctuations that I know have certainly drawn attention from many over the last 13 years or so. You'll see in that chart the top line represents our general education staffing. So think of the general education line as our classroom teachers, art teachers, music teachers, and so on. As noted, the district's reduced by almost 25 full-time equivalent teachers over these years, so back to 2010, 2011. At the same time, though, very clearly, front and center, the categories of special education, educational assistants, and more specific staffing in the categories of guidance and psychologists, et cetera, they've all increased, and rather significantly. There's no question about that. And if anything, we believe that this is the counter to the narrative when I know community members ask why our staffing may be increasing when enrollment is going the other direction. And I think that while there's a lot to this important story, I think in many respects this captures exactly what's taking place here. And I don't know for a fact, but I would certainly argue that I'm sure this is true in most other districts around us. Slide 7, our path to fiscal year 25. So that was a look back in time, if you will. Let's look ahead to where we are now. In December, the administration provided a preliminary budget plan to the school committee at 4.34% increase over fiscal year 24's budget. The increase, when presented in December, reflected our administration's estimates based upon the information that we had at the time. Our team met with the temporary town manager in early January. And as noted there, request was made to the department to try and decrease that overall increase and bring it in alignment with 3.75% increase, which we did. There was also in that same conversation a request to identify possible capital expenditure items that we may be able to shift out to future or outlying years if we could make do, so to speak, with some of those items. We also took a close look at that. Our central office leadership team identified 2 areas of our planning financially to align with the temporary town manager's requests, and they're highlighted there. We identified the increased use of circuit breaker funding and additional salary savings, and we're certainly happy to talk more about that should members of the committee have further questions. Slide 8. You are, sorry.
Excuse me, Dr. Brand.
Yes.
Do you mind if people interrupt you to ask a question that's
certainly,
on
if you wish,
a
yeah.
current page?
Of course.
All right, so just want to let the committee know that. Feel free to.
Didn't know if you wanted me to plow through, but happy to do that however you'd like.
What would you do for the additional salary savings? What have you done in the budget?
Those additional salary savings were, based on the timing, there was staff put in for retirement. So we incorporated some savings from their salary to an estimated new salary, as well as we had some staff had resigned and/or were replaced during the period. I mean, we start this budget in October, and our first presentation to the school committees mid-December. So, and it takes a couple weeks to get everything done. So from, mid-November, if you will, till end of December or the beginning of January, things happen. People put in for retirement, staff resign, or we replace someone who might have been in an open position initially. And then, so we take we make an assumption of what the new salaries will be, and we take that into account. So those are kind of the salary savings.
Thank you.
How do you increase the use of circuit breaker funding? Isn't that calculated by the state?
Yes, so in circuit breaker funding, each year the school system, all school systems, get a reimbursement from the state based on special education tuition costs from the prior year. And it's another formula that they go through, but it's capped at around 75% reimbursement for a tuition cost that's above some threshold. So all districts receive that money. So in FY '24, our anticipated reimbursement's a little bit higher than we had estimated the actual will be. So we took some of that reimbursement and used as an offset in this budget. So in the student support services area of this budget, you'll see there's special education tuitions, and then there's a circuit breaker offset, so which is a negative number, because we actually charge tuition costs to that account, which is a revolving account. So we just increased that negative number, if you will, by $69,000.
And you were able to take it from one fiscal year to another?
Yeah, circuit breaker funding, it's in a revolving account, and
Okay.
whatever you receive in one fiscal year, you have to charge tuitions to it either in that fiscal year or the following fiscal year. So you can carry it 1 year.
Okay.
So we try to be conservative and as much as we can, as most school districts. If you can carry something over, you carry it over to help with any unforeseen situation. So we were able to do that.
Okay.
One of the things that I'm pleased about is the level of transparency that our leadership team and school committee tries to provide for community members around the development of the budget. At this point, there have been multiple public meetings with and through school committee meetings, including a public budget hearing that was held a short time ago. Additionally, we've continued this year in what is our second year of holding budget subcommittee meetings, an actual subcommittee of the school committee. And those are open to the public. I just included the dates there for which we've met. It is not lost upon me that our organization represents the largest department within the town's expenditures. And with that, I think it's all the more important to the community to have the opportunity, should they wish, to follow the developments of any budget planning. We know that it's an important point of community interest. Next slide, if you could. So there are 4 factors which I think when we think about this fiscal year 25 budget plan, help provide context for the story, if you will, of the budget. First off, inflation driving up costs. We know that. We've spoken to that. But it's indeed true as we take a look at from the smallest to largest items, a subscription, for example, for some technology program. Those are third-party companies, and they can, at will, raise those rates, and in turn, if we wish to continue to use those services, we have to respond in kind. So those are realities that our budget is contending with. We are still absolutely contending with the impact of COVID, and we're happy to talk more about that if you wish. But while the pandemic officially may be over, the impact on students and learning loss is not, and it continues to be a reality that districts far and wide are contending with. The continuation of really positioning public schools as what I think is coming to be the most important social services organization in communities far and wide. And I understand that challenges are intensifying for families who may need support of various kinds, but there is a shortage in their ability to access those, and understandably, it's the schoolhouse, it's the school system that's turned to next. And again, that's certainly not just a Wilmington reality. I think that is in many places. That's exactly the reason why we added the 2 family engagement specialists a year ago when we had to make that decision around the expiration of the COVID grant funding. We added them to the district because we could see very clearly how heavily they were tapped into by families, so much so that through additional grant money, I forget the exact grant title that came about through DESE fairly recently. Our team made the decision with that grant funding to add a 3rd family engagement specialist. They are maxed out. The reliance of our families, of many families, looking for additional support is through the roof. And it's just something that is not sort of within the direct purview of, say, our school counselors alone, our teachers alone to contend with. So just a small sliver of the reality that the districts are facing, including ourselves. The next slide, if you would.
Could I just
Certainly.
ask you a question regarding the COVID impact on learning? It's been a couple of years now. Have you seen any improvement or any feeling that kids are starting to drop off of your list of kids needing help?
It's a great question, and I mean, I'll certainly defer to, I have my colleagues with me, but let me take a first pass at this. I think that, so yes, certainly things are, this is my term, no one else is, so stabilizing. But at the same time, the realities are when there may be a particular issue or situation that arises, and then very quickly, sort of from a developmental standpoint, let's say a child is, 3 years out or 4 years out where they are, we will kind of trace back in time to where they were developmentally at the time of the pandemic. And oftentimes, and sometimes it's just anecdotally, it's not necessarily driven by science or raw data, but there is a through line there around what they may have been, how they may have been impacted developmentally at, say, age 7, and where they might be right now. So sort of that lagging impact is there. And I don't know, Christine or Alice, if you want to add to what I did there.
I would just say that and we're still also seeing occasionally, so for example, in a middle school data meeting, we're talking about math, and we're recognizing through our assessments that certain students who would have been in 5th grade who were remote that year, we had to compact the curriculum, they didn't get to all of the content, and now we're seeing that impact their ability to go to that next level in the middle school with math, and we have to backfill skills. So we're still seeing the results of that, where students are certainly making good gains and progress, but we're not through it completely yet.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Next slide. So just a couple more things to try to put in context this budget, fiscal year 25 budget. One of the things that we've been watching closely here in our school system is the continual changing nature of the student population that we serve. I know there's a lot of information on this slide, so I apologize for that. Let me try and highlight the key things I think that what this is trying to indicate here. So back in 2021, 2021, for the first time in history, Massachusetts saw more than half of public school students who are considered high needs. Now, high needs is a category that we didn't make up here ourselves as our team. It's a term that the Department of Education uses, and they have a definition for that. You can see that's sort of at the top of that slide there, at least how the Department of Education defines high needs. They have to be students who fall into one of 3 categories. They could fall into more than one category, but 3 categories: English language learners, students with disabilities, and economically disadvantaged. During the 2022-23 school year, as you note there, over 55% of the state's public school students were identified as high needs. And largely speaking, there is no question, at least from our view of things, that enrollment in Wilmington is really mirroring those trends. Maybe not at the exact same numbers, but mirroring the trends in terms of the continual rise of this subgroup of our students in the high needs. That snapshot there, that table, is taken directly from Department of Education data. those percentages for the last few years, and you can see it broken down. I won't, in the interest of time, read all of those, but highlighting the students with disabilities, English language learners, and so on. So I think the larger point here trying to make in this from a context standpoint is these are realities that we're grappling with, that are, again, our enrollment as an entire district, maybe on the slight decline, maybe stabilizing, and I think it's the latter. I'll speak to that in a moment. But the reality is within the subset of our student population, we have other changes that are emerging that are making things challenging in different ways to try and respond to, which takes us to the next slide and part of the budget planning, honing in specifically on English language learning. There is an additional allocation in this budget of additional partial staff as well as funding to support translations. And the reason for this is a couple of fold. So it's not under the umbrella of special education, but there's still a legal obligation for school districts, public school districts in the state to ensure that there are appropriate levels of services for students who are in need of English language instruction. In the last 4 years, those numbers you can see there have gone from 29 to 55. Recognizing that on the face of that may not seem like a huge increase. So 55 students right now, and this may have changed. These are dated from a number of weeks back. But what is true, I think, about this is the following, that makes this a little more challenging for us. All of these students are not in one place. So it would be one thing, say, if we had all of these students under one roof. That's not the reality. They are spread out over many of our 8 schools. And so, arguably, like many other facets of our operations over that many schools, it's a challenge at times, and this, I think, firmly is another example in trying to best and most efficiently staff and respond to those challenges spread out over so many schools. And so we've made the decision to make up for some lost time. Said another way, we recognize that we should have had, in fact, a little more staffing in this complement of our operation, and so this budget plan adds 0.6 FTEs to try and shore up that additional support. And finally, I think the final point to indicate here is, while we don't know for sure, nothing is for certain, there's every reason to believe that this group of students will continue to expand, as it is in other communities nearby, as we move forward. In fact, honestly, internally from our leadership team, some of us have sort of questioned how and wondered why this number isn't even higher at this point when we hear some of the data from surrounding communities not far from us here. Just as out of interest, purely, the next slide, I thought folks may find this interesting. This is actual, representative of the wide variety of languages that our students and thus many families speak throughout families here in the town of Wilmington. This is, this obviously carries itself in different ways and shapes and forms into our school settings. Translation of school documents as a prime example of that need for schools everywhere, and again, not just here in Wilmington, to have to respond to this. Communities arguably, say like Boston or Cambridge or Somerville, arguably may have been at this place in time years ago, and they've been able to scale up their operations. For communities like ours, smaller communities, this is work of a different magnitude, because we're trying to scale up, but doing so within quite a different context, but still something that we need to do legally. So next slide, if you would. So unless there are any questions on any of that, and I'm again happy to take as we.
Yep.
Thank you, Dr. Brand. So I struggle a little bit with putting these students into certain buckets.
Yep.
So we get the high need students, and then we have the COVID-related students, right? Is there ever any overlap where one student could be in both buckets at the same time?
Sure. Yes. Yeah. And I'll just say, some of the, use your term, the buckets, some of those are, right, some of those are DESE created terms, right? Rightly or wrongly, helpful or not. Sometimes that may lead to funding, grant funding or supplemental funding, which can help in the delivery of services. Other times, let's be honest, it's a metric that is being followed for their progression or their improvement from a learning standpoint. So we don't always love those either, and those buckets. But I think the utilization in this kind of case, to me, sometimes is a way to sort of see how things are evolving or changing. But
Gotcha. I just asked the question because if we're telling the budget story in the context of, well, we have certain students with COVID needs and therefore we have a reflection in the budget, and we have these other students with these other needs, and but
yeah.
they could possibly be the same students. So that was just the clarity I was
Yeah,
looking for.
and if I may, just sort of one other point, one of the things that sort of is tangled in all of that is, depending on, again, to use the term bucket, some of those, they have attached to that a legal obligation, right? And so special education or English language learning, for example. So it becomes something that we have to be much more mindful of to make sure that sort of level of service defined to, say, hours of instruction, specialized instruction, we have to comply with. We like all other districts, are audited regularly. We can some other time go into all of that if you wish. That's a whole other thing and a whole other host of acronyms. But they will come in and audit school districts to see how well are you aligning with the provision of services to meet those, the student needs that you have, such as English language learning.
Gotcha.
Maybe not the COVID piece, but English language learning. So.
Okay, thank
I
you.
have a question for you as well. Just in general, when you have a child that is not proficient in English, I'm assuming that's what we're talking about here.
Yes.
Are they ever identified at a kindergarten screening, or when they're 3 years old, they can be screened for certain abilities that need to be focused on prior to getting into school? Does the state offer anything for a language at that young an age? And it'd be easier at 3 and 4 and 5 for them to pick up English, but maybe there isn't the support at the home. There's no one at home speaking English. But in any event, is anything there to help them before they actually enter our school system?
Yes, but so the short answer is yes, but I'll turn, because I know that they'll be able to give you a much deeper answer. Christine, do you want to?
Well,
Take that or Alice.
I would say that,
No, I'm sorry, you should probably come up to the mic. I'm thinking that people may not be able to hear you at home.
So whenever any student enters our district, they complete a home language survey, and so we assess that right away to determine if they need to have that level of support. But I would defer to Alice around for any of the early intervention. Would we have access in the preschool, or is it? Sorry.
So if the student is known to us because would be enrolling, they would receive a language screening, whether it's kindergarten or preschool. If they're in early intervention, that should be a component of the early intervention program. But if they're not known to us and don't enroll till kindergarten, we wouldn't know the child.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yep.
But unfortunately, not anything provided by the state in terms of assistance per se. But
Oh.
again, a reality of, and that's not to say that sometimes there aren't some sources of funding, but
Mhm.
but often not. And again, some of the things that become a little more taxing in a magnified way on a smaller school system such as ours,
Mhm.
and others around. So. Okay. And certainly if you come up with a question you want to go back, we certainly can. So shifting to enrollment, obviously a very important component of trying to establish a budget for schools and the provision of services and meeting class sizes and so on. So a few slides that follow here around enrollment, and then happy to certainly pause and take questions if you have it. I think there's a big picture here around student enrollment and related to our projections. And that is that we really believe, taking a look at the data, that the decline in enrollment has stabilized. And we do the best we can with the information we have to project. And what is consistent is that projection. Certainly Paul can speak to that more, but the 3-year, what we term as the 3-year cohort survival methodology, if you will. So taking a look and seeing how many students stay within our midst from year to year. It's the same projection that's been used for a long time. And so there's consistency in that. And based upon that big picture, we really are taking a look at things and would we think aptly describe it as stabilized, that we're projecting a relatively stable enrollment pattern for next year and we think as we move ahead. Our projections, if you take a look at the numbers that are before you and within the various presentations we've done, indicate a decrease of 23 students, pre-K to 12, from fiscal year 24 to 25. And I should note, please keep in mind, this is from October 1st numbers. So things have changed since then. And just as a reminder, that October 1st is a key date because that's when we, and all districts certify their enrollment with the Department of Education. So all of these numbers are, and what you'd find on DESE's website is October 1st. Anyway, we have a slight decrease from 24 to 25, but I think it's important to keep in mind that decline is, again, that spans multiple grades, multiple schools, and because of the way that has taken shape, we don't have any recommendations in this budget plan for the reduction of teachers going into 25. 8 schools spread out. We could have a couple here, one there, kind of thing, and so it's not a one location or grade level. In terms of future enrollment projections, and obviously that's the unknown, of course. Things that could point us as a school community in a direction that has a change or an impact on our enrollment, new school construction. If that, hopefully it does, a new building comes online. Oftentimes, and this is, maybe there's data to support this, but certainly anecdotally it seems that can become a great interest, a magnet for new families that may be considering a variety of communities. Continued growth, we'll talk about this more in a moment, from the middle school to high school, the retention rate, and certainly other new housing projects that may come online, down the road. That could all obviously increase as we move forward. The next slide is slide 14. This is sort of the long-term, this is the current snapshot of our October 1 numbers. And I know there's a lot, it's a busy slide, lots of information, but what it shows you broken down by grade level is what the certified enrollment, that October number is that I mentioned before, you broken down by grade level and by school. Slide 15, highlights of the Wilmington High School. Of course, I recognize that this has been a point of a lot of conversation of recent note. We continue to track that enrollment very, very carefully, particularly from the 8th to 9th grade. We've called that the retention rate, or we call that the retention rate. Thinking about that, in other words, how many families who have children in the Wilmington Middle School at 8th grade make the decision to stay enrolled in Wilmington Public Schools across town in the high school. You can see on this slide the retention rate historically going back, the last few years anyway, to 2018 to 2019. If you take a look farther back, you'll see a couple of things. You'll see variability. If anything is a pattern, it's that. It's not the same, bless you, from year to year. That's number one. Number two, as we've talked about before, we have always had we use the term a healthy number of our 8th grade students who have opted to pursue high school in a setting other than Wilmington High School. Large contingent, of course, enrolling in Shawshene Tech and or other private schools. I think the thing to note here, though, as we've carefully tracked this as we've gone to 2023-24, is that the retention rate, as you can see, is the highest it has been in a number of years. And I can tell you, this is not the official October 1st number. However, I will tell you that third bullet, I think, is an important one. We have had over 30 Wilmington high school-aged students enroll in Wilmington High School who are attending high schools outside of town. So that 71% number will absolutely be higher next year. I don't have the exact number because I only want to use the October 1st numbers. But the storyline here is the retention rate is up, at least in comparison to the last few years. And I think there's a whole lot of things that may be accounting for that. We can certainly talk more about that. But we've seen a good number of students, I'll say return to Wilmington, who were perhaps enrolled or who were enrolled here previously.
Do you have that number that's returned this year so far?
So 30 since the start of the school year.
30.
15, my understanding is 15 or approximately 15 since October 1st.
So that's 30, we lost 55 from grade 8 to 9. So you're saying 30 have returned? Or 15?
Not 30, either grade 9, 10, 11, or 12.
So you're giving me the whole high school, not,
Yeah, just-
not between
Yes.
8 to 9?
No.
No. So a lot
So
of them
do you
might-
have the 8 to 9, ninth graders returning, broken down?
Past October 1st, you mean?
Yes. Because we lost 55 from grade 8 to grade 9. So have any of the grade 9 returned after October 1st? When you,
Grade 9, so I have to check that.
Okay.
I have to check that number.
I'd be interested to see
yeah, yeah.
how many of the 55 return, if any.
Yeah.
When these students are returning, are they primarily coming from the tech, or are they coming from private high schools?
Quite a few from the tech. I don't want to say every single one coming from the tech. That would not be accurate.
Right.
And again, we're going off of, I should point out, this is sort of unofficial information, meaning it's not state numbers, right? So I want to preface that. But, we are in contact with the high school continuously, and they track this. So I would not want to throw out a percentage to you right now in terms of how many students are returning from the tech, but
Right.
we're watching that. It's a high number. It's a high percentage, of the students who have returned. There's some from private schools. There's some who may have attended a different tech school. But we've seen a good number from the Shawshing Tech return.
So I guess my concern with kids returning from the tech is probably two reasons. One is that they don't really have a choice. They're being asked to go back to Wilmington. Or secondly, it wasn't a good fit. They shouldn't have gone there in the first place. And for those students, I feel like that's on us, because they should have had a very good idea of what they would be getting into at the high school versus going over to the tech. And that those kids, more effort needs to be made to capture as many kids as possible that are kind of fleeing out of lack of understanding or knowledge of what the high school offers, which is substantial.
Yeah.
And thinking that it would be easier or more fun to be at the tech, and that's not necessarily the case.
I'll take it, it's not really I'll take it as a question, though, in a
Yes.
way, in terms of response, but it's a good point. So I'll say this, that first off, there has been under Mr. Gender, he's in his second year as a new principal of the high school, a tremendous level of work with his team to make stronger connections, shall we say, with eighth grade students and families. Highlighting and spotlighting the very thing that you're talking about, how do we try and make sure that a student and their family knows all that awaits them at the high school in Wilmington, and see if that's a good match for them. So that's number one. And there has been, I could talk about Lynn, and certainly Mr. Gender can at a future if you want, but things like, for example, taking our student leaders down to the middle school at lunch to meet with students there, taking our student athletes down to talk with them about the program. So those kind of things have ramped up exponentially in the last, call it a year and a half. I firmly believe that that's right now making a difference in a way that has been, it's new, right? A refreshed energy sort of the high school. That's number one. Number two, as to the fit of a student at the Shawshing Tech and whether or not it was a match for them and what they were hoping to achieve, that's something there's a high interest in. Every story is different for every student, of course. We hear things anecdotally, whether or not that's true or not. Like, for example, did they not get into the right courses or the right stream there, and did that force them to make the decision to come back? I think there's a whole host of explanations there. We want to understand that.
Mhm.
We want to respect the fact that there will always be a catchment of our students who that is a great spot for them. As Dr. Jackson has said before, we are a community that has two high schools for which students and families can choose. We want them to make the right choice at the outset, as opposed to partway through their academic career.
Right. So I'm assuming all of that data is being tracked at the high school level and drilling down to exactly
As much as we can.
what happened
Yeah.
here.
As
to
much as we
create this
can,
change.
you know, and sometimes our efforts will, when students and families decide to leave the school system, we do our best to try and drill down on that. We don't always have the responses, right?
Right.
It's not for lack of trying, but sometimes we just, you know, we can't capture that.
Okay.
Can I ask a question? Dr. Brand, thank you. In years past, you've mentioned that you've done a survey of eighth graders. Do you still do that? And what are the results of those surveys?
Just to clarify, do you mean those that are considering leaving
Yes.
the school
I
system?
apologize. Yeah, I
Ye-
apologize.
Yeah, so we did do that again last year. I don't have those results here tonight. Certainly can get those, but yeah, it remains. Again, for that effort, I wish that the response rate were 100%. It's not always, so you know, that being the case, but it's important. Even if we sort of weren't as closely monitoring this as we are trying to do. I think that's important data in general. Just, you know, people decide to leave a school. Why? To understand that. So we'll continue that effort, and I can follow up with that, see what the latest data is, and when we do it again at the end of this year. So
Thank you.
One more question from me, if you don't mind. So, Dr. Brand, I'm just trying to get grounded in what good looks like or should look like. So when I see 61 to 71%, that seems good to me. But like, what's the goal? Like, what? Because I'm looking at from 2018 to 2024, we're kind of bouncing around between, you know, that 50, 60, 70%. Like, what is it that you want to see? I would imagine 100%. You'll probably say, but like, what's realistic based on the demographics of the town, the fact that we have another great high school right next door, population, all of those things.
that's a great question. Never really thought about what the goal would be. I think the goal, honestly, and I don't hope this doesn't come across as cliche, would be as we do back to the two options. If we have students and families making the choice that's right for them and what they want from an academic experience, when I take a look back historically at the data, and we have all this, you can see a very there has been for the longest period of time a good complement of Wilmington students who have pursued. We'll focus this conversation right now just on the tech, right? There have been these percentages. They go all over the place. When you take a look back 20, or I forget how long, but it's 20 plus years. But it's never been consistent from one year to the next. It's bounced around. So I'm also interested in like why is that? And I don't think you see sort of a through line of 75%, 75%, 75%. It's varied from year to year. So it's a tough question. I don't know. You know, I don't think it, based upon the past, I think it would, it's not likely to be the case that we're going to be 100% retention. And that's just fine, again, because that's a great option and a great different program of studies. But to me, my worry has been, do we have students pursuing an educational experience outside of Wilmington for the right reasons? And there's been some hints, some themes around that as a concern. It's been one that I've had, and I think that, well, I can't speculate on some of that, but if it's been the case that we haven't done a good enough job making sure that families and students understand what sits there, though, well, that we needed to fix, and I think we're doing that. And if that accounted for some students deciding to leave, I think that's being corrected. I don't think we'll ever see it at 100%, but look, at the more that we can retain, to me, that speaks to not just about a numbers game, although I know that's important, but about clearly we're doing something right in building programs or opportunities for students to find of great interest, because there is a choice, right? So.
Yep. Thank you.
If I could just add, in your budget books, I believe there's a section enrollment in the bottom of a busy document. It shows the retention rates from the 2009-10 school year to current. And just looking at that, the highest retention rate from 8th and 9th grade was 81% in the 2016-17 school year. Everything else, we had a few down years. But it's been in the 65 to 75 range. So there's always a complement of students that are going to go to a tech or another school. The other thing is that, and I think kind of to what Ms. Manganelli said, that, and I've said it before here, is once we get the kids in high school, they don't leave. So
Yeah.
the key is, to retain them as much as we can, because if you look at, again, the retention rate from 9th to 10th, 10th to 11th, 11th and 12th, in some cases, it's over 100%. Those are kids coming back. So we don't really lose the kids. It's just we got to, work, as the superintendent mentioned, that we are, to keep those kids here. The ones that it's the right fit for, those students.
There's another, in the interest of time, I won't, unless you want me to, I can go into some more detail, but one of the things, just a final point, at least of this, not so much about enrollment, but about the high school. Mr. Gendron and his team, he shared a presentation a number of weeks back with our school committee about plans for launching a new schedule for next year. That new schedule, I don't know if anyone caught that presentation, but essentially, I think that new schedule is going to be another factor that will point more students to really kind of think about the high school. It's, in essence, it's going to add another course that students are going to be able to take, another class in their schedule. And there's a whole lot more to this, so this is a whole presentation unto itself. We don't have time tonight, but certainly I think that the opportunities for students are even going to become richer for students to not only take core subjects, but also electives. And that's one of the shortcomings that I think our current schedule has had. Mr. Gendron believes so, and his predecessor too. That'll be another factor there that I think will serve as a strong magnet for students to consider the high school. In the interest of time, I'll press ahead, but we can talk more about that if you
Yeah, I'd
if
like
you'd
to circle back, because I have some
Okay.
questions with
Sure.
class sizes
Okay.
and adding electives.
Okay. Slide 16, so there's a lot of numbers on this, of course. There's the reason that I opted to try and include this, again, I know there's been so much discussion around enrollment in our school system over the years. How does that compare to other districts? Are we unique in seeing a decline in students, and so on and so on? This is just the last couple of years, and I think, to me, I think what this shows, I think, are a few things. First off, there's great variability all around us, including Wilmington. And I think that, as you can see, that certainly we had, going into this year, of this community set, the highest decline in students. You can see, but at the same time, other districts such as Reading, North Reading, is completely, call it flat or stable. Woburn was up considerably, but if you take a look at Woburn and the reality there with the asterisk of 84 students, at least at the time of the generation of these numbers, October 1st, 84 of those students were migrant school-age children. Some may be tracking that or following that in terms of Woburn as one of the communities who've taken in migrant students. So there's a lot of variability all around. And in terms of our decline, there are two things that I think are worthwhile pointing out, not just for the group here, but also our community. We have a smaller class size at the 8th grade making its way through, so certainly that's part of this story. The other is Wildwood. I'll just acknowledge that. Our Wildwood enrollment is down from what it's been in the past few years. We have our theories about that, and I'll share these briefly. I think first off, there was obviously the unknown around, well, what would that school look like in its function and operation at the middle school? And again, this is anecdotally. I think it probably serves or stands to reason that some families just weren't certain about that. And certainly some families have options, right, at the pre-K level. That's number one. Number two, the distance from one side of town to the other. We understand anecdotally may have been a challenge or hardship from some families. And so those factors, though, that being the case, again, nothing is for certain, but my prediction from the information that we have is that we're going to see that number bounce back up at the Wildwood, that by all accounts, things are working fairly well at the Wildwood at Carter Lane campus. And I think that that will help boost that enrollment. So that's just a factor to point out. But, you know, these challenges, these struggles of declines, I mentioned I was at a meeting the other day with some of my counterparts, and I was talking with the Tewksbury superintendent. I didn't realize this, but they have been facing similar declines in enrollment as we and some other communities. They opened their new high school, it was either in 2012 or 2013. I didn't know this before I had the conversation yesterday. It opened with 1,200 students in that high school, I'm told, and they have about 700 students now. So they are grappling with some of these changes as well too, and how to figure out how to respond and what's going on there. So can't say that that's true for all communities. Obviously, Billerica has seen an increase, but I just thought it was interesting to sort of debunk the sort of that narrative of we're alone in this. I don't think we are, and I think that this holds true. I've talked about this before, of communities facing declines in enrollment statewide, some more pronounced than others, and there could be various reasons on that. I'll jump ahead to slide 19 and sort of the heart of the budget and the numbers for fiscal year 25. So the budget drivers going into next year, negotiated contracts, first off, just to note, for all of our bargaining units are in place. So we know what those contracts are, and we've been planning accordingly in terms of the projections. The total increase in the budget to support our employee groups is noted there. Again, just as a reminder, these are all contractual, so built into our negotiated contracts between the school committee and the various units are what we refer to as steps and lanes. So any questions on that for clarity, certainly feel free to ask. But that amounts to just a little over $900,000. Salary increases for all of our employees, you can see just a little over $1 million. And longevity, that's a factor in some of the contracts. For those that are entitled to that, just a little over 11,000.
What's the negotiated COLA for this year, for next year?
3 1/4.
3 1/4.
A lot of other moving parts here, but some salary replacements and reductions that we, you know, if we are at a place where we can say, for example, phase out staffing some of our more intensive programs if we have students moving on, that kind of thing. We've identified a reduction of 4.80 FTEs going into next year. That you can see the corresponding decrease in budget amount there. We have, though, at the same time, right alongside that, the need to add 3.60 FTEs to a variety of legal or contractual requirements. I highlighted English language learning as one earlier. And so you can see sort of the bottom line of how that nets out a reduction of 1.2 FTEs from fiscal year 24. Slide 20 is just a snapshot of, kind of broken down in a different way, of what this looks like for all of our employees across the school district. I can appreciate and recognize fully for those that don't work in our jobs or our roles that it might be hard to kind of discern exactly what and who we have working where. And we thought that this graphic kind of depicts this nicely in terms of the array of different staff that we rely upon day in and day out to serve our students and our families. You can see the category of breakdown there of a little over 488 full-time equivalent, that FTE staffing to support the operation of our 8 schools. Slide 23, the personnel changes for, these are slides that Paul and his team work hard on to kind of, so they have a similar look. If they look familiar, you would have seen them last year if you were in the committee. This is a roll-up, if you will, of the personnel changes from fiscal year 24 budget, which is captured, you can see at the top of that slide, down to the bottom, fiscal year 25, and as mentioned, 488.15 FTEs is what we are planning for at the present time for staffing for next year. Slide 24 is the respective salary changes. All of this was really highlighted in that earlier slide, so I'll just go through that quickly. The percentage change you can see down the bottom, the breakdown The salary changes collectively roll up to 4.24% change from fiscal year '24. We talk an awful lot about, next slide, please. We talk an awful lot about the personnel, and obviously being a people business, the school district is. The bulk of our expenses go towards supporting those 488 plus staff. But I think sometimes it's easy to get lost in the fact that there are an awful lot of other costs that school districts need and rely upon to operate our systems and programs and services. It's just an effort to try and put these into context. What does out-of-district educational expenses look like? And you can see there in the top left. It is the case that we obviously rely upon the fiscal support of the town for capital items related to technology, but we also have a whole host of items that are not capital that we have to plan for. As an example, the information technology roll-up of just under $450,000. Again, I won't go through them all, but sort of an array of the other costs that collectively roll up to over $10 million. So a significant amount to run a school system of the schools and staff and programs that we offer here.
I have a question.
Sure.
So when we set up or bring in specialists to service or to educate children who otherwise may have gone out of district, so I think we started this a number of years ago,
Right.
to try to keep them here.
Yes.
Give them exactly what they need at a much more affordable cost. So do we ever invite other communities that have children of the same type of need in to round out that classroom?
Great question. I know the answer, but I'll give the floor to Alice if you want. I do know the answer, but I'll let her speak
We
to it.
actually have tuitioned in 2 students over the years, but it really needs to be a fit. And a lot of times when parents are feeling like their student needs more, they're not looking for kind of a lateral placement. They're looking for something that requires more, that would provide more services. So occasionally, but we've done it twice over the years. Yep.
And it sits there as an option. I've been in other districts where we've done just that, right? And if you have a critical mass, and that mass could be small, of students to build a specialized program, but you unexpectedly have, say, a couple that move out, which happens from time to time, legally, so to speak, and with the arrangement with the Department of Ed, you absolutely can do that, and sometimes it can work nicely for both the sending community as well as the receiving community.
Okay, thank you.
Slide 26 is the non-salary changes. Again, just more line-by-line roll-up, and you can see that roll-up of just a little more than $10 million. That percentage change, if you're wondering, from 24 to 25, 1.93%. So a comparison, if you would, Paul, sorry, next slide, slide 27, comparison from this fiscal year to next fiscal year, the dollar change and the percentage change, and again, that bottom right corner, which we mentioned at the outset, 3.75% increase. So just to close out, bear with me, thank you for your patience, just a couple more slides. So, we know that, as mentioned at the outset, these are tough financial times, and we're doing our best to try and deliver to the community that conservative budget that still at the same time meets our deliverables, the things that we need to do in the best interests of our students. We know that around us there are communities that are in an unfortunate position of seriously having to face the possibility of operational overrides, which, I sense that list might be growing. We also know, and sometimes this is captured on the media more recently, some of the other fiscal challenges that, from a budgetary increase standpoint. I think that these things are real, and every situation could be different, and there could be different factors driving or putting this pressure out there. But these are amounts that are different than the past few years, arguably, that I've seen in some of the headlines. So I just think it's worth keeping in mind's eye as we take a look at the future out years. I skipped over capital, didn't I? Did I do that?
Yeah, you did.
Yeah. Capital, we can come back to that, not to skip over a big amount, but you can see the various items there, and the outlying years, as we've done in the past, to try and work with the town's 5-year projections. Of course, and I can appreciate one of the questions may be, what happens with the hope that a new building comes online, a new school comes online? That clearly would have an impact on this capital planning, and we would have to adjust accordingly once we know what that building configuration is. So, 31, if you could. So in terms of what this budget plan will accomplish, and I mentioned that we've tried to be conservative with this, and it's true, we have, but at the same time, well, we are characterizing this as a level service budget. It does ensure that students are in classrooms with highly qualified staff, of which we have so many. We're so fortunate here in Wilmington. We've got great staff in place, and this will afford us to continue to keep those staff and our employee in service to our students. It will continue, as we touched upon before, to ensure that as many students as possible are educated in the district. There will always be, unfortunately, the reality that some students will need to receive their services educationally outside of a district. That I don't think will ever be 100% possibility, but we will continue to strive to do what we can to keep as many of our Wilmington families and their children in our district. It provides increased support for our growing population of English language learners, as we've talked about. It continues to ensure that all students have access to athletics and transportation and so on without user fees. And it does continue to the best that we can. This is this family engagement specialist piece specifically around the sort of the wraparound service that we're trying to be as responsive as we can to the needs of many of our families. So I think with that, we'll just slide 34. I'm looking ahead to fiscal year 26, and then happy to open it up to questions. We want to, and I certainly as your superintendent want to continue to try and move our district forward. We have a lot of great programs and services in the works, and we have a staff that is anxious and eager and have their sleeves rolled up in planning ahead. In our town is a great leadership team who's trying to guide that work, and we want to continue to move forward our programs. We want to continue to try and innovate, and sometimes that doesn't require funding, sometimes it does in various forms, but we want to try and do that, and we want to be mindful of that in terms of what the budget is. It is worthwhile noting, though, that as we do go into next fiscal year, all 4 of our labor units will be up for renegotiations. I mentioned we've got our contracts in place for next year, it's true, but as we think about the year ahead, a year from now, fiscal year 26, we will be in that place of renegotiating. Anyway, I know that that's a lot of information, both in this presentation and in the packet. Thank you for your time in walking through this. There's a lot to take in, but certainly happy to answer any questions you might have about fiscal year 25.
I have a couple of them, and then I'll open it up. The change in the school times. Where did we ultimately end up? And how much did it cost us to get there?
Well, I guess if a financial cost is the key question there, or the aspect of your question, in the end, and help me out if you think I'm forgetting anything, but in the end, we did find it necessary to add 1 bus to our fleet. So from a financial standpoint of changing the school start times, that's right, going into this year, as many may know, there was not a financial cost. There was not a negotiated aspect to that with any of our bargaining units. We did, however, we've been operating for the last couple of years 16 school buses, 16 full-size school buses to transport students. The change in start time, there's a whole host to this topic and conversation, of which we had many, but in the end, we made the difficult decision with the school committee support to add an additional bus to our fleet, so now operating 17 buses. So if there was a financial cost associated with the start time, I would say that, right?
Yeah.
That would be the loan
for
cost.
Start time, but we added some time on learning, and we lengthened the teacher work day as well. So if you're talking about that.
Right, so both of them. But, so
Yes.
let's just take the middle school and the high school, for instance. What did we add in terms of time on either end? And I know in the high school, there was always a problem with sports, and when the students were getting out, as well as trying to get them in later, get them in later and get them out earlier. So Where do we land on that?
So I think the change in start times, we had the middle school and right now, the middle school and high school start at the same time in the morning, and the middle school ends 5 minutes earlier than the high school does. And so there's really, to doing that, there was no cost per se, it was just, and we had looked at times with other districts and so forth because of athletics and so forth, so they're starting at 8:30.
For the,
Middle school and high school starts at 8:05, and they're out
8:05.
at 2:30, 2:35. And the high school used to be 7:40 to 2:05.
just in terms of athletics and the question there, we are still, there are high schools that are ending later than us, and so that actually there has not been, my understanding from Mr. Ingram, our athletic director, there's not been an adverse impact or negative impact in terms of getting our student athletes to games or matches. Like I said, there are other schools that have actually a later end time.
So what time do they get out before at the high school?
2:05.
2:05. So we added 25 minutes, or 30 minutes. They now get out at 2:35.
They start later, though. They start
They
later.
start later, but they're getting out at, okay.
Right, 2:30, right.
Okay. I have another question, just a comment, with grant positions. So I guess because of COVID, it opened up a lot of grant money. And when you're sitting over here, you're looking at grant-funded positions and saying, yeah, that's terrific. But is that a position we would have started if we had to pay for it from day one? And we all know we're going to end up most likely keeping these positions because now it becomes something you have and you're not going to give it up. So grant positions sound wonderful, but financially, they can really play havoc with your budget. And I'm wondering, I know there have been a couple of times that you have not maintained a position
Right.
from grants, but how, like, are you taking that into account when you are determining whether or not to bring somebody on payroll after the grant expires?
I mean, I'll certainly welcome any of my colleagues to jump in on this, but I would start by saying that, I'll speak for myself. We never look at, or I never look at a grant position as an automatic, well, once that grant expires, we're just going to add it to the budget. I mean, you know, each of those positions are unique, and you're absolutely right, the COVID grant money was a unique time period. But I wouldn't want anyone to sort of make the default sort of assumption of, well, if we're going, as a district, if we pursue grant money and we are able to secure grant money and that leads to another position, that's a quick end run around, you know, being thoughtful about the position. What does it provide? Does it fulfill needs that we have? And if so, then we make that difficult decision to add it to the operating budget. The family engagement specialists, I'll go back to those. I know I mentioned those. Those were two positions that, quite frankly and quite honestly, when we added those, you have to keep in mind that this was in the thick of the pandemic. And so we were creating positions that we didn't exactly even know how they would unfold and how they would play out. When we got through the 2 years and saw what they provided and saw the need that still existed there, we made, as you know, that difficult decision to say, we feel that right now, in this place and time, they're still so valuable for us, we need to keep them. If the evaluation of that, not to pick on those folks or those positions, was, you know what, the crunch has passed, all that brought with the pandemic has sort of passed us by, and we don't feel that they're any longer necessary, I would tell you, I'd be the first to say, you know, they've served us, but we don't need them any longer. We do make those decisions, and it just depends on the position.
Okay. Well, I mean, we've always looked at the school department as being, you know, the heroes and going after grants and bringing in a lot of money, which we've always appreciated very much. But that's the dark side to it.
Sure.
I'll open it up to any comments or questions on the committee.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
So,
Okay.
thank you. I just had a couple of questions. First of all, on a somewhat budget-related issue, there's been a lot of talk about our brilliance state Department of Education about high-quality literacy curriculum. Is the literacy curriculum we currently use in Wilmington considered high quality by the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education?
It is, but Miss Elliott, there you go.
This past school year, we have undergone a pilot. We actually, speaking of grants, we received an extensive competitive grant over 3 years from the Department of Education that has helped to fund a new early literacy screening tool, as well as a good percentage of, almost the whole package of a new K-5 literacy curriculum that we'll be adopting fully in September. Our pilot teachers are continuing. We made that decision in January after a fall pilot. They're continuing the year with the materials this year. All of our staff will be receiving the new materials. Actually, they're in the being shift as we speak. And our staff will be trained starting in March. With Outreach, we're adopting a program called Interreading, which is a evidence-based core literacy program, inclusive of all components of literacy. We're really excited. We have fantastic support from our staff overall, and they're really invested. Our committee that selected the program was well over 30 teachers and administrators who all were very invested, in this multi-year process to make this decision.
So maybe I shouldn't have maligned the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. I guess some old habits. But, so how much was that grant? So what type?
We got about 300 and, over a 3-year period, 386,000, I think, something like that.
And that wasn't a staff-based grant, that was a
No, it's-
materials, supplies, and training type grant
Correct.
that we would have had to pay for.
Yep, you'll see in my curriculum budget, I'd like to make note, it's a reduction in the curriculum line item this year. So next year, when it goes back to not being in the negative, you'll understand why.
Thank you. Thank you. That's exciting to hear. Thank you. I've had a lot of years, spent a lot of years with this budget, as Paul's predecessor, perhaps. And remember when Wilmington Public Schools was a lot bigger and had 2 fewer schools, when the Boutwell was being rented out to a church and the middle school didn't exist, and the high school was smaller than it is now. And if we want to make any meaningful impacts on the cost of education in Wilmington, in my opinion, the way we have to do that is to open our eyes and recognize that educating 2,800 kids in 8 schools is the most grossly inefficient way, both from an instructional perspective, from a relationship perspective, and from a financial perspective, to teach the kids, to serve the families of this community. One of the reasons why, respectfully, we need family engagement specialists is because we don't have enough time to establish relationships with families, because by the time we get these relationships, they're moving on to another school. And by the time that new school has started to establish relationships, they're moving on to a new school. These kids have 3 transitions in between pre-K and 5. It is grossly inefficient, and we have an opportunity to start to change that tide. I'm not a member of that committee, but I urge anybody who is to strongly see this opportunity for what it is with the Wildwood School and to start addressing these issues, because Wilmington is not going to be a 4,000 student public school system in the next 20 years. It's going to be a 2,800 to 3,200 student public school system over the next 20 years, unless we open up, unless the floodgates open up. So this is our chance. And I'm looking at you because I know, and I'm not looking at you because I'm lecturing you. I'm looking at you because I am a former colleague. This is our chance, and I hope we are able to take advantage of it.
Did you have a comment, Miriam?
Is he done?
Oh, yeah.
On the busing, go back to the busing. The increase, is that for the extra bus that was added?
So there's an increase from a contractual standpoint. So I think on one of the slides, it showed, let me just find it. General education athletic increases about $70,000, and that's contractual. It's the second year of our 3-year plus 2 option year contract that we did into last year. And then we added a bus, it was about a little less than $80,000.
Okay, so
a
that's,
bus.
that's reflected in the
Correct.
139.
Yeah.
Andy, who is it?
I had a
Oh, yeah, okay,
question.
I'm sorry. Go
Thank
I'll
ahead.
come back.
Thank you, Dr. Brandes. Great presentation, very informative. I have a question about staffing categories and some of the trends over time. It seems, generally speaking, there's sort of a contraction of general education and an expansion of special education and educational assistance. And I'm wondering if you're seeing, if you expect that trend to increase in the future, and what you think the impact to personnel budget is going to be in, say, like the next few years.
Well, yeah, thank you for the question. It's good. I think that I'll focus first on general education. I mean, certainly, and again, I'll go back in some respects to connect to Dr. Jackson's comments a moment ago about some of the ability for us to adjust staffing-wise across. Let's just take a look at the 6 elementary schools for a moment, right? If by happenstance there's a swing one way or the other that happens in one building, that's easier and more, we're able more to respond to that. If there's like a dip here and a dip here, but they're separated by geography in 2 different schools, sometimes it's not enough to make those adjustments. We try to best we can equalize our staffing and pupil-teacher ratio across our classrooms. Again, I'll just focus this on the elementary schools, but sometimes it doesn't work perfectly. But if we can adjust, and we do so, and Paul's been here certainly longer than I, and we've talked a lot about this, if, let's say, that there is enough of a drop in enrollment, I'm making this up, at the West, there just happens to be a smaller cohort of students making their way through, we have, and we will continue to make that adjustment, even if it's for 1 year off. In other words, decrease a section, decrease a teacher. We can respond in that way when it works sort of in that localized fashion. So I think it will be what will dictate where we go with the general education will be what happens with our overall enrollment, right? One way or the other. The same holds true, though, if we have a couple of students, say, add to the West and a couple of students to Shawsheen, generally over the classrooms we have, at least in recent years, we've been able to accommodate those and incorporate those into the classroom spaces we have. The special education and edge assistance is a much more difficult thing to be able to predict. I wouldn't want anyone here or otherwise to think, despite all of what we're saying around trying to educate students in district and so on, doesn't mean that, or this shouldn't be looked at as a continual, inevitable ramp up of staffing in these categories. As a case in point, our planning for next fiscal year, we were able to reduce, as part of that complement in one of the slides, we did reduce a program in special education at one of our schools because we had a drop in enrollment. And we determined that it was no longer necessary to operate that program, and so we closed that program. Now, 3 years from now, depending on those students that may join us, we may have a different need to respond to, but so that's hard to predict. I think back to the earlier question, which I appreciate, what's the goal? Is the goal to have out-of-district students to be 0. Again, no, that's never going to be possible. And it's hard to predict if that's right-sized or not. It is about opportunity. It's about having space in our schools to offer these programs. That's a thing that we sometimes come up against. I mean, yes, our enrollment's declining, but if you've been in our elementary schools, we don't have a lot of space. So sometimes that's a limiting factor. Accessibility can be a limiting factor. One of the things that I'll certainly say we're excited about the prospect of with a new school is to be able to build the new school facility that's fully accessible for our students. And if that provides an opportunity to create a program, if we have a critical mass of students, whatever that mass is, we'll do so. And if we can't, we won't. So that's hard to predict. Both of those are hard to predict. But I just want to convey that we want to try and we will continue to adjust wherever we can. And that special education program closure hopefully is one that sort of get a sense of.
So just a clarification, like when I'm sort of looking through these numbers and I see just a gross movement of FTEs from one category to another, it's really sort of a localized phenomenon
Yes.
to meet a specific need in a specific school or department.
Yes, yeah, and in most, not necessarily all, because I don't want to take away from the fact that, as I've tried to also convey, that the needs are increasing for a lot of our students, right? So not even the more specialized programs, but and if they get to a place where we have to say let's say, for example, a psychologist. So if we need to add a psychologist because we have a critical mass of students that require those services, we might have to respond in that way. But it is more localized in the sense of what are the needs of students in our care. So,
Great, thank you.
sure.
Question about English language learning. So in just looking at slide 11, I mean, it looks like from 2020 to 2023, that number almost doubled, right?
Yes.
So like when I think about the budget impact associated with those learners, the budget story kind of tells me, okay, I need translation services. There's a
Right.
budget impact there.
Right.
I need heads to actually teach these students English. But if I were to step into their shoes, I'm going to be behind the other students. Is that fair to say, as far as, I'm spending a lot of energy trying to learn English, and maybe I'm not at the same grade level as the other students in like math or science or something like that. So my mind takes me down the road of, aren't I then spending more money on those students to play catch up at some point with the others? And that's, I don't know the answer to that, and I'm not sure these slides tell me that, but it seems like for every English language learner, there just may be more of a budgetary impact than just translation services and English as a second language services.
There may be, but at the same time, and Christine, you're welcome to join, but please feel free. But I'd also say that, the one reality for an awful lot of these students that maybe if they're receiving appropriate services is that at a point in time, they can be phased out of the need for further services, right? So depending on their point of entry, depending on their language level, if you will, at that point in time, with robust service that can meet their needs, they will be able to, from the language standpoint, be able to catch up and then no longer require services.
Yeah, exactly. And I would just add that for our students who are English learners who enter our district, we're determining what their proficiency level is of English. We have some students who we consider newcomers who are just barely learning the language. So yes, those students aren't necessarily able to keep up in reading class. They may do well in math class with some support to help understand the directions and things like that. But oftentimes we see those students who are receiving support from the English learner teacher, as well as intervention from our math tutors or our reading specialists early on to help support them as their language is developing so that they are able to keep up and not fall further behind. We're really trying to prevent that. And then again, if there's a suspicion that a student who might be an English learner also has a disability, we're evaluating them for that disability to determine if that is so, and then offering special education services if eligible. But as Dr. Brand said, our goal is for these students to learn, become proficient enough in the language that they're able to access the education we're providing with support from their classroom teachers, sheltering the language in the classroom so that they eventually can access all of the instruction, so.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Sure.
Back to the high school for a moment. I know you talked about adding electives to make it more attractive to students. Looking at the size of some of these classes as it is, some of them are very small.
Yeah.
What is your plan if you're adding electives? How can you justify having such small classes here and maybe having an elective that might only have 4 kids in it?
Yeah.
And what kind of staffing impact is that gonna have?
Great question. Thank you for it. So let me expand a little bit more on this because there's more to this to sort of put it in context. But and unfortunately, Mr. Gendron couldn't be here tonight, and he had a family commitment. But I can speak for him because I've spent time, as is Miss Elliott, and I shared with you that he provided recently a presentation to the school committee on his plan. The backstory on this, and it connects, if you bear with me, to your question around staffing. So a number of years ago, the NEASC, New England Association for Schools and Colleges, thank you, Dr. Jackson. We are an accredited high school, and through that process, like all high schools, if they want to hold that standard, they have reviews done. And a number of years ago, it was back in 2021, I think, when Ms. Peters was here, NEASC came for a visit. And overall, the high school did quite well through their findings, and all of their report and such is very public, and we provided an update to the community through the school committee. One area, though, that they identified as sort of a flag was our schedule. Let me explain a little bit more. One of the things that they identified in the schedule, and so my understanding, and please keep in mind, I wasn't here at the time when the new school opened in 2015, was, so I think the schedule's been in place since then. And they found they had concerns, NEASC, the visiting team, had concerns, as did some staff, around was the schedule best meeting all of our high school student needs? And in short, just in the interest of time, one of the things that was recognized was a couple of things. If you were a student who required special education services, and you still had the core subjects that you had to take for graduation requirements, you had very little time in your schedule left for anything else, right? As you know, the committee there's things that students have to take to graduate, right? Similarly, if you were a student who was was following a pathway in the performing arts, and you were taking a world language graduation requirement, and certainly for college-bound students, pretty important these days, you had very little time left in your schedule to pursue electives. Keeping in mind, electives can be such things as business studies, right? So it's not just what one might think of as whatever you want to think about it as an elective, right? So anyway, the point being is that study then led to a committee of folks who got together, staff then, and then Principal Peters, to study the schedule. And they came up with some recommendations for some changes. Once Ms. Peters, there was a couple of things that sort of delayed the implementation of that. Ms. Peters knew that she was leaving. She wanted to have a chance for the new principal to come in and to be able to get a hold of this before launching it. The new schedule that is in place and that will be implemented for next year will have students instead of taking 7, we'll be able to take 8 classes. That's a remedy for that shortcoming of the schedule that I mentioned earlier. So it may be an elective class, it may be another core class. Let's say, for example, a student is interested in science and they want to double up on sciences. They can do so in the new schedule. It's not leading to more staff. Staff have contract requirements of how many classes they teach, but there'll be another class added. So what you will see, I know this is hard to follow, and I have visuals, but in the interest of time, I can pass them out. But the visuals, in all honesty, I brought copies just in case this came up. And this is a public document that Mr. Gendron shared with the school committee. But you can see the impact of sort of the blocks of schedules. It will lead to the class sizes across many of these sections going up. The simple reason for that, you have the same number of students in the building right now, they're taking 7 classes. But next year in the new schedule, they're going to be taking 8. We're not adding staffing, but we're adding a requirement to take another class. That will bump up those class sizes. I want to make clear, that's not the reason to go down the path here of this schedule change. That was the quick backstory of all that was leading to it. But one of the implications will be the the student-teacher ratios in many of those classrooms. That's, having spent time with Mr. Gendron and understanding this at a 20,000-foot level, I can see exactly how this will play out. It has the potential to play out, and you'll see a difference in many of those class sizes when we're sitting here next year. It has to be, because again, students have to take that many more, hundreds of more seats again have to be filled because of this additional class, so.
It's cut down the class time? Are you cutting?
A little bit, good question, but like, I forget the total number of minutes. I don't know, Miss, I don't put you on the spot, Miss. But still, and actually one of the I won't say a criticism, but one of the concerns voiced by some of our staff as well as the current length of periods is just a little bit too long in the high school schedule. So sort of moving it just a little bit, maybe to a more of a sweet spot, with that difference in time not felt to be a detriment, to whatever subject it is. So I think there'll be a lot of benefits. And I should say, Mr. Gendron and his team have shared through a feedback opportunity with students and families and staff this new schedule before finalizing a decision. And the feedback's been very, very strong, very positive. So I think it sounds like it has the potential to meet an awful lot of needs, so.
Have we, how are they going about determining what new classes to bring in? Is the middle school involved in that at all? Like, are any of those children in the 8th grade being quizzed as to what they're interested in? We've brought up robotics before and
Right.
Engineering and that type of thing.
I want to, forgive me if I misspoke, I want to clarify. This schedule is not in and of itself leading to a whole battery of new classes being created and added. And so, forgive me if I misspoke. It's requiring students to take, or creating a spot to take another class. Like, they have no choice. They're going to have to take another class. Our calendar of courses, our course of studies, doesn't necessarily have to change for this to happen, but it allows that student to take another class. That all said, just as would be the case even if we weren't going through this new schedule change, if there's a course that seems to consistently be undersubscribed, interest has been waning in that, or another course like robotics or something else that emerges, just like we would do today or would have hopefully done yet last year, that'll all be evaluated as well too as we go forward. So, the schedule will afford students the chance to take another one, but things, if we right-size things and have an array of courses that are best meeting students' needs and interests, then we'll be in a good place. And I'm sure they'll continue to evaluate that as they go forward. I can certainly, I'll hand this out afterwards. This is a copy of Mr. Gendron's presentation. It has a lot of more information, but we'll put this, I think, in more context, so.
Are there any other questions from the committee? No? Any public comments? Okay.
If I may, I'll just jump on Dr. Jackson's comment back about the Wildwood and the school building opportunity. I know you're busy folks with the budget season, but if there's a point in time, I plan to reach out to the select board also to, extend an invitation. If you'd like for myself and members of our team to come and provide you with an update. We know we have representation on the Wildwood School Building Committee around this table, but would be more than happy to. We've got a lot of work underway. I would imagine some of you might be following it, but maybe not everyone. We'd be happy to come if that's appropriate and if there's interest in sort of giving this committee a special presentation, so to speak. And like I said, I plan to reach out to the select board as well, if there's interest too. So we can certainly do that if you'd like in the future.
Maybe you could just tell us what the next big step is. I think we're all waiting to get to the point where you're analyzing what sites and narrowing that down.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of in short, here's I think the big things that you should be aware of. We're moving forward with what's called an educational program plan for the new school. That's a pretty extensive document that details what we expect to happen in the walls of the building. The school committee will be approving that by the end of March. But beyond that program plan, the next 6 months, having just talked at some length earlier today, in fact, with our designer, the next 6 months are pretty key for this project, with a lot of work still to come, and Glezo, you know, and others in the room. But these next 6 months, we'll call it, through until August, are pretty key in terms of what are the possible options that this building project may take, and whittling down the choices. Getting to a place in time, sometime I think it's around August, where this project in the town will have to submit to the MSBA the preferred choice, preferred option. So in these next 6 months, a lot of work has to happen, a lot of information has to be conveyed to the community to get us from where we're at now with a whole host of options, with sites undetermined and so on, or finalized yet, to that place of saying, you know, this is what we want. And when we do submit that document has to be, submitted by the superintendent, by the school committee, by the select, or the town manager, I guess. But it seems to me like this is important that the respective governing boards have information on all this too, to understand where we're heading. So, again, I think these next 6 months they're key.
And
I can-
Dr. Brand, if I can get, probably heading toward a vote for a new, probably school debt override, next town meeting, 2025.
2025, right?
If I could-
That's the target of the committee, to make sure it gets on the agenda for the annual town meeting.
I think right now we have about, I think it's 18 options that we're looking
Yeah.
at, which include, you have to do an option for
Literally,
each
18.
Yeah.
configuration, pre-K, pre-K3, pre-K5, and it's gonna be new, reno, and add something, or whatever. And then, so we have 18, we have to whittle that down to a more manageable number, so that's kind of what we're doing. And that manageable number will be down 6 to 8 different options. That's site, as well as the 3 consolidation options, as well as brand new or renovation. So once we get to that 6 to 8 or whatever it is, that goes to the MSBA, but then a lot more work from the designer occurs. And then from that, at some point, we come down to the preferred option that will get voted on.
And just to add to that, they're hoping by, I believe, the end of March to have some prices.
Yes, that will be coming
And
fairly
that's-
soon.
That will be, that will be
Yeah.
key.
I think I would love to hear from the committee specifically, maybe even after town meeting, as we start to ramp up to the next one. And I know there's some important decisions to be made, and it's certainly that committee's responsibility. But I think all the major board, I know the school committee's involved and the select board will be involved. I think it would be important for the finance committee to be involved as well.
Yeah.
In spite of the fact that we have ample participation by a member, but I think the whole board would be helpful.
I think-
That's my input.
No, I agree. I think it's just trying to find out, like, at what activity
When,
point
When?
would be
Yeah.
the most valuable for us to be sitting in the audience for. I know that you're all working very hard and spending a lot of time in meetings, but there's some point that it's really gonna, maybe it's picking the site. Maybe it's not so much picking the configuration, but the site might be of great interest to people on the different boards.
I certainly can talk to.
We'll leave it to you.
I can talk to our owners project, our town's owners project manager to assess this, but my guess is perhaps, and I know you lead up to town meeting, so maybe this is a terrible idea for all of you, but I think probably April might be a good month to maybe consider, but.
We'll be here.
Okay, well, not.
But I think we need
but-
to get it past
but-
the 16.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, which will start to come. But anyway, I'm happy to follow up. with
I,
it, but-
I think the important thing is that we appreciate the invitation and would like to, and we'll leave it to you as to when, or the committee, as to
Yeah,
when.
what's the good
We'd love
time?
an update from the committee.
Right.
And when, we'll leave it in your hands because we don't know the process other than Mary Ann. So
Sure, thank you.
that would be great.
Yeah. Okay. So, and no other questions or comments? We've asked them enough? Thank you very much. It was a
You all.
great presentation.
Thank you all for coming.
And thank
Thank
you all
you.
for coming.
Move
for
to
all your hard
adjourn.
work.
We're still gonna do, well, I guess we went through everything, right?
Well, did we have minutes?
We don't have any minutes right now. Probably
guys.
next Thursday, we'll have a couple of them.